candles flickered against the stained glass, casting shadows that danced across my trembling hands. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, mingling with the polish used on ancient wooden pews. I knelt there, knees aching against the hard floor, my fingers clutching a worn rosary, the only thing my mother left me when she died 3 years ago. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "I need help. Any help." I'd never been this desperate before. 18 weeks pregnant, recently fired from my main job at the hotel, behind on rent, and now Mateo, the baby's father, had disappeared with the last of my savings. The landlord had given me until Sunday to pay the 3 months of back rent, or he'd start eviction proceedings. All I had left was this part-time cleaning job at Mr. Salvatore's mansion, but that wouldn't cover half of what I owed. I hadn't even told him about the pregnancy. Housekeepers with complications weren't kept around in houses like his. The cathedral was nearly empty on this Wednesday afternoon. Just a few elderly women scattered among the pews, their heads bowed in quiet devotion. I'd chosen this time deliberately, when I could speak to God without an audience, when I could beg without shame. "I don't know what to do," I continued, hot tears sliding down my cheeks. "I have no one. My baby will have no one. I just need—" The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open, letting in a sliver of afternoon sunlight. I didn't turn around. People came and went all the time. But then I heard them. Measured footsteps, not just one pair but several, moving with purpose down the stone floor of the center aisle. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the church. The air seemed to thicken. Even the elderly women sensed it. I saw one turn her head slightly, then quickly look away. Only then did I glance back, and my heart stuttered in my chest. Antonio Salvatore, my employer and the most feared man in the city, walked down the aisle flanked by 2 of his ever-present guards. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, making his broad shoulders look even more imposing. His olive skin contrasted with the silver at his temples, and his expression, as always, was unreadable behind those dark eyes that missed nothing. I quickly turned away, shrinking into myself. In the 8 months I'd worked at his estate, I'd only encountered him directly a handful of times. The head housekeeper had given strict instructions: become invisible when the master of the house appeared. Do your work silently. Never make eye contact. Never speak unless spoken to. I had followed those rules religiously. Until now, when fate had cruelly placed us in the same sacred space. Mr. Salvatore took a seat 3 rows behind me and to the right. I could feel his presence like a physical weight, though I dared not look again. His guards remained standing, one at the end of his pew and another near the side entrance. I tried to continue my prayers, to focus on my desperate plea to heaven, but all I could think about was whether he had recognized me, whether he had heard me. I wiped away my tears with shaking hands, trying to compose myself. Minutes passed like hours. The candles burned lower. An elderly woman shuffled out. And then, just as I had convinced myself he hadn't noticed me at all, I heard movement behind me. Lucia. His voice was deep, quiet, yet it filled the cavernous space around us. It wasn't a question, but a statement of recognition. I froze, unsure what to do. He knew my name. In 8 months of cleaning his house, I didn't think he'd ever even looked at my face long enough to remember it. I slowly turned, keeping my eyes downcast. "Mr. Salvatore, look at me." My head lifted almost against my will. His eyes were dark and intense, studying me with uncomfortable scrutiny. Up close, I could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, with notes of cedar and amber. His face was handsome in a severe way, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed by carefully maintained stubble. "You work in my home." "Yes, sir." My voice sounded small, even to my own ears. He glanced at the rosary clutched in my hands, then back to my face, where the evidence of tears was still fresh on my cheeks. "You are in trouble." Again, not a question. I opened my mouth to deny it, to protect my job, my last lifeline, but something in his expression stopped me. For a moment, I thought I saw something beyond the cold calculation he was known for, something almost human. "Yes," I admitted. the word barely audible. He studied me for another long moment, then reached into his suit jacket. My breath caught in my throat, unsure what to expect, but he simply pulled out a business card and held it out to me. "Come to my office tomorrow, 10 o'clock. I took the card with trembling fingers. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock, with only his name and a phone number embossed in dark ink. "Do not be late," he said, cutting off whatever I had been about to say. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, his guards immediately falling into step with him. I watched his retreating back, the card clutched in my hand like a lifeline, or perhaps a death sentence. Everyone knew what Antonio Salvatore was. The legitimate businesses, the real estate holdings, the restaurants, the shipping company, were just the surface. Beneath ran currents of darker enterprises, whispered about but never openly discussed. The doors closed behind him with a heavy thud that echoed through the cathedral. Only then did I release the breath I'd been holding. What did he want with me? Had I done something wrong at his house? Did he somehow know about my situation? My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Being fired was the best-case scenario. I'd heard rumors of people who crossed the Salvatore family simply disappearing. I looked down at the card in my hand, the embossed letters catching the candlelight. Whatever was going to happen, I had no choice but to face it. I had nothing left to lose. I barely slept that night, tossing in my small bed in the apartment that would soon no longer be mine. By morning, dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my stomach churned with both morning sickness and fear. I dressed with care in my only decent outfit, a simple navy dress that still fit over my small but growing baby bump. I pulled my dark hair back into a neat ponytail and applied just enough makeup to look presentable rather than desperate. The Salvatore estate sat on 5 acres of manicured grounds at the edge of the city. I usually entered through the service entrance at the back, but today, following the instructions on the card, I approached the imposing front gates. The security guard recognized me immediately. "Miss Rossi," he said with a nod, looking surprised to see me there. "Mr. Salvatore is expecting you." The driveway curved through immaculate gardens before reaching the mansion, a sprawling stone structure that looked like it belonged in the Italian countryside, rather than the American suburbs. I'd cleaned its many rooms for months, but approaching it this way, as a guest rather than staff, made it seem even more intimidating. Another guard opened the heavy front door before I could knock. "This way," he said without preamble, leading me through the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier. We passed the rooms I knew intimately from cleaning, the formal living room with its antique furniture, the dining room with the table that could seat 20, the library with first editions behind glass, but then turned down a hallway I'd never been permitted to enter. At the end stood a heavy wooden door. The guard knocked twice, then opened it without waiting for a response. "Miss Rossi, sir," he announced, then stepped aside to let me pass. The office was surprisingly understated compared to the opulence of the rest of the house. Dark wooden bookshelves lined the walls. A large desk dominated the space, behind which sat Antonio Salvatore, looking exactly as he had in the church, except now he was in his domain, his power even more palpable. 2 other men stood near a seating area by the fireplace, both wearing suits and expressions that gave nothing away. They looked at me with cold assessment. "That will be all," Mr. Salvatore said to them. "Give us privacy." The men exchanged a brief glance before nodding, and exiting through a side door I hadn't noticed. The guard who had escorted me also departed, closing the main door behind him. And then I was alone with one of the most dangerous men in the city. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. I obeyed, perching on the edge of the seat, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. Up close, I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair was shot through with silver at the temples. He was older than me by at least 15 years, but there was no denying his commanding presence. "How long have you worked in my home?" he asked, his voice even. 8 months, sir. "And before that?" I swallowed. "The Grand Plaza Hotel, for 3 years." He nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. "And now you are in trouble." It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer. My gaze dropped to my hands. "Look at me when I speak to you," he said, not harshly but with unmistakable authority. I raised my eyes to meet his. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was seeing past all my carefully constructed defenses. "I heard you in the church," he continued. "You need money. You are with child." The father is gone. Heat rushed to my face, embarrassment, shame, and a flash of indignation that he had listened to my private prayers. But what could I say? It was all true. "Why did the hotel dismiss you?" The question caught me off guard. They said it was downsizing, but I think they realized I was pregnant. Something flashed in his eyes, anger, but not directed at me. "And your landlord threatens eviction?" I nodded, wondering how much he had actually heard at the church and how much he had discovered since. 3 months behind? "Yes," I whispered. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. For a long moment, he just studied me, his expression unreadable. I fought the urge to squirm under his gaze. "I have a proposition for you, Lucia Rossi," he said finally. The way he said my full name sent a shiver down my spine. "My mother is coming to stay. She is difficult, particular about her surroundings. She will need a personal attendant who is discreet, competent, and trustworthy." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "I would offer you this position," he continued. "It includes room and board in the East Wing, a substantial increase in salary, an immediate resolution of your current financial difficulties." My breath caught. Was he offering me a lifeline? It seemed too good to be true. "Why me?" I asked before I could stop myself. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something that transformed his severe features for just a moment. "You work hard. You are thorough. You never speak of what you see in this house. And now you need help." I remained silent, waiting for the catch. There had to be one. "There are conditions," he said, confirming my suspicion. "You will live here full-time. Your days off will be arranged according to my mother's needs. You will sign a confidentiality agreement that extends beyond your employment." He paused, his dark eyes holding mine. "And you will tell me everything about the man who abandoned you and your child." The last condition made my blood run cold. What would Antonio Salvatore do with that information? Everyone knew what happened to people who crossed him or his family, despite everything Matteo had done. Did I want that on my conscience? As if reading my thoughts, Mr. Salvatore leaned forward. "I have a certain code, Lucia. I do not harm innocents, but neither do I allow wrongs to go unanswered." I swallowed hard. "And if I refuse, then you leave here with a severance payment sufficient to cover your debts. You find another position elsewhere. Our paths do not cross again." His tone was matter of fact, no threat evident, yet somehow that made it more frightening. The choice stretched before me like a fork in the road, both paths disappearing into fog. Security and protection for my child, but tied to a man whose business I didn't want to know. Or freedom, but with all the uncertainty and struggle that came with it. My hand moved unconsciously to my stomach, to the small life growing there. "I accept your offer," I said quietly, sealing my fate. Something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his face. He pressed a button on his desk, and almost immediately, the door opened to reveal one of the men who had been there when I arrived. "Marco, show Miss Rossi to the East Wing. Have her belongings collected from her apartment. Handle her outstanding debts." The commands were issued rapidly, each one received with a short nod. As I rose to follow Marco, Mr. Salvatore spoke once more. "Welcome to the family, Lucia." I couldn't tell if his words were a blessing or a warning. Either way, as I followed Marco through the winding corridors of what would now be my home, I knew that my life had changed irrevocably. I had made a deal with a dangerous man, and there would be no going back. The East Wing of the Salvatore mansion was like entering another world. While I had cleaned these rooms before, I'd never seen them furnished and prepared for guests. Now, as Marco led me through the private sitting room with its cream-colored sofas and into the bedroom beyond, I could hardly believe this would be my new home. "These are your quarters," he said, gesturing to a suite larger than my entire apartment. "Mrs. Salvatore Sr. will be in the main guest suite across the hall." The connecting door allows direct access when she requires your assistance. The bedroom was elegant but not ostentatious, with a queen-sized bed draped in soft linens, a writing desk by the window overlooking the gardens, and a spacious closet that would hold 10 times the clothing I actually owned. An ensuite bathroom gleamed with marble and chrome. "Your belongings will be brought this afternoon," Marco continued, his tone professional but not unfriendly. "Mr. Salvatore has arranged for additional suitable attire to be delivered tomorrow. Mrs. Salvatore Sr. arrives in 3 days. You'll be briefed on her preferences and needs tomorrow morning." I nodded, still overwhelmed by the sudden change in my circumstances. Just yesterday, I had been praying in a church, desperate and alone. Now I stood in a luxury suite that was apparently mine, employed by the most feared man in the city. "Is there anything you require immediately?" Marco asked. 1,000 things rushed through my mind. Questions about my role, about Mr. Salvatore's mother, about what exactly I had agreed to. But I settled on the most pressing concern. "I should see a doctor, for the baby," I said, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach. "I haven't been able to afford proper prenatal care." Marco nodded as if he'd been expecting this. "Dr. Bennett will be here at 4 o'clock. She's the family physician and will handle all your medical needs discreetly, of course." Nothing was left to chance in Antonio Salvatore's world. "Thank you," I said, unsure what else to add. Marco reached into his jacket and produced a small cell phone. "This is for household communication. All important numbers are programmed. Mr. Salvatore's is number 1 if there's an emergency. Mine is number 2 for day-to-day matters." He placed it on the bedside table. "Rest now. Someone will bring lunch shortly." With that, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. I stood in the center of the room, suddenly alone with the enormity of what had just happened. I sank onto the edge of the bed, its softness another reminder of how drastically my life had changed in the space of a few hours. I should have felt relief. My financial problems were solved. I would have proper medical care for my pregnancy. I had secure housing and employment. Yet beneath the surface, relief bubbled a current of unease. Nothing in this world came without a price, especially favors from men like Antonio Salvatore. What exactly had I agreed to? And what would he do when I gave him Matteo's information? The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Dr. Bennett, a brisk but kind woman in her 50s, had confirmed that despite my lack of prenatal care, the baby was healthy. "A strong heartbeat," she'd said with a small smile, the first genuine warmth I'd encountered since entering the Salvatore household. My meager belongings had been brought from my apartment, looking shabby and out of place in the elegant suite. But as promised, new clothes had arrived. Practical but expensive maternity wear, nightgowns, robes, and comfortable shoes. Nothing flashy or revealing, everything appropriate for a personal attendant to an elderly woman. I'd been briefed extensively on Sofia Salvatore's preferences and needs by Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper who had previously managed the staff I'd been part of. Her demeanor toward me had shifted subtly. Not quite deferential, but no longer treating me as just another cleaner. "Mrs. Salvatore Sr. likes her coffee with 1 sugar, never artificial sweetener," she instructed as we walked through the kitchen. "Breakfast at 7 precisely. She'll take it in her sitting room. Linens change daily, even if she insists they're fine. Room temperature exactly 72 degrees. She'll complain it's too cold, but if you adjust it higher, she'll complain it's stuffy." The list of preferences went on, painting a picture of a demanding, particular woman. No wonder Mr. Salvatore needed someone dedicated solely to her care. "And most importantly," Mrs. Reynolds added, lowering her voice, "never mention Mr. Salvatore's business or visitors. She prefers to believe her son's wealth comes entirely from legitimate enterprises." I nodded, filing away this information with all the rest. It seemed Sofia Salvatore practiced a deliberate blindness to her son's activities, something I would need to master as well if I was to survive in this house. I hadn't seen Antonio Salvatore since our meeting in his office. According to Mrs. Reynolds, he had been away on business, but would return this evening before his mother's arrival the following day. Part of me was relieved at his absence, giving me time to adjust to my new role without his intimidating presence. Another part remained anxious about our next encounter, about the information he still expected me to provide about Matteo. I had been putting it off, but I knew I couldn't delay forever. That evening, after dinner, served in my room like I was some kind of guest rather than staff, I sat at the writing desk and began to write everything I knew about Mateo Santos, where he worked or claimed to work. The friends he'd mentioned, the places he frequented, the excuses he'd given for needing my savings. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. When I finished, I folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. I had just sealed it when a soft knock came at my door. "Come in," I called, expecting Mrs. Reynolds with another list of instructions. Instead, Antonio Salvatore himself stepped into the room. He filled the doorway with his presence, still in a business suit despite the late hour, though he'd removed his tie and unbuttoned his collar. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced, but no less intimidating. I rose quickly, suddenly conscious of my simple cotton nightgown and robe. "Mr. Salvatore, I didn't know you had returned." "Just now," he said, his eyes taking in the room, then settling on me with that same intense scrutiny I remembered from the church. "You're settling in?" "Yes, thank you." I gestured vaguely at the luxurious surroundings. "It's more than comfortable." He nodded, stepping further into the room. His gaze fell on the envelope in my hand. "Is that for me?" I swallowed hard, then held it out. "What you asked for." "About Mateo." He took the envelope, sliding it into his jacket without opening it. "You've seen the doctor?" The abrupt change of subject caught me off guard. "Yes. She says the baby is healthy." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "Good. My mother arrives tomorrow. You've been briefed on her needs?" "Extensively," I assured him. "She can be difficult," he said. And for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the sun behind the fearsome businessman. "But she is my mother, and she will be treated with respect." "Of course." He studied me for a long moment, and I fought the urge to fidget under his gaze. There was something discomfiting about the way he looked at me, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why did you keep the child?" he asked suddenly. "When the father abandoned you, when you had nothing. Many women would have chosen differently." The personal question caught me completely off guard. I wrapped my arms protectively around my middle, buying time to form an answer. "This baby is innocent," I said finally, my voice soft but steady. "Whatever Mateo did, however difficult things became, that wasn't this child's fault. I couldn't punish an innocent for someone else's sins." Something shifted in Antonio Salvatore's expression, a subtle change I couldn't quite interpret. For a brief moment, I thought I saw approval, maybe even respect in those dark eyes. "You have principles," he said, and it sounded like both an observation and a compliment. Before I could respond, he turned toward the door. "Rest well, Lucia. Tomorrow will be demanding." He left as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving me standing in the middle of the room, the ghost of his presence still lingering in the air. Sofia Salvatore arrived the next day with the fanfare of a returning monarch. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the main entrance, security personnel emerging first to check the surroundings, before a small, elegant woman stepped out of the middle vehicle. Despite being in her 70s, Sofia Salvatore moved with the confidence and grace of someone much younger. Her silver hair was styled immaculately, her tailored suit expensive but not flashy, her jewelry understated but clearly valuable. She had her son's commanding presence, though where his was built on fear, hers seemed rooted in an aristocratic bearing that assumed obedience. I waited in the foyer alongside the other household staff, dressed in my new clothes, hair neatly arranged, hands clasped in front of me. Antonio Salvatore stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, the only one who stepped forward as his mother entered. "Mama," he said, taking her hands and kissing her cheeks. "Welcome home." "Antonio," she replied in a voice that carried the faint accent of her Italian birth. "The flight was terrible, the food was inedible, and customs was a nightmare. I told you to send the private jet." He smiled slightly. "It was being serviced. I sent the next best thing." She made a dismissive sound, then turned her attention to the staff lined up for her inspection. Her eyes, the same deep brown as her son's, moved from person to person until they landed on me. "This is the new one?" she asked, though clearly she already knew the answer. "Yes, Mama. This is Lucia Rossi. She'll be taking care of your needs during your stay." Sophia moved closer, examining me with the same intensity her son had shown, though hers felt more critical. She's pregnant. The blunt observation made heat rise to my cheeks, though I kept my expression neutral. Mr. Salvatore had assured me his mother knew of my condition and had no objections. Yes, Mama, as I mentioned. Sophia sniffed slightly. Well, at least she looks healthy. An Italian heritage, with that name? My grandparents were from Naples, ma'am, I replied quietly. This seemed to please her. Good. I cannot abide these American girls who don't understand proper respect or tradition. You will help me to my rooms now. I need to rest before dinner. With that, she swept past her son and started up the staircase, clearly expecting me to follow. I glanced at Mr. Salvatore, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. I quickly fell into step behind Sophia, listening as she began a running commentary on everything from the decor in the hallway — Antonio always had questionable taste in art — to the state of the country, going to ruin, of course, with these politicians. By the time we reached her suite, she had covered at least a dozen topics, requiring nothing from me but occasional murmurs of agreement. The grand suite had been prepared exactly to Mrs. Reynolds' specifications, fresh flowers arranged just so, temperature precisely controlled, her preferred brand of mineral water chilling in a crystal decanter. Sophia inspected everything with a critical eye before turning to me. Unpack my things. The blue case first. It has my medications. Then prepare a bath. Not too hot, not too cold. And I'll take tea. Earl Grey, with lemon, no sugar. I nodded, moving to the multiple suitcases that had already been brought up. As I began carefully removing her clothes and arranging them in the closet, she watched me, arms crossed. So, she said after a moment, my son has brought you into our household, a pregnant girl with no husband, very unusual for Antonio. I kept my eyes on my task, unsure how to respond. Was this a test? A trap? I make no judgments about your situation, she continued. The world is hard for women alone, but I am curious why my son, who values his privacy and security above all else, would bring a stranger into our inner circle. I finally looked up, meeting her gaze directly. I worked here before, ma'am, as part of the cleaning staff, and now you are carrying a child and have no place to go, she observed. My son has always had a weakness for strays. The description stung, but I kept my expression neutral. Mr. Salvatore has been very generous. She made a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement. My son is many things, but generous without purpose is not one of them. She moved to the window, looking out over the gardens. He sees something in you, girl. What that is, I do not yet know. But I will. The words held both warning and challenge. I continued unpacking, my mind racing. What game was being played here? Was this why Mr. Salvatore had hired me, to satisfy some curiosity of his mother's? Or was there something else at work that I didn't understand? The father of your child, Sophia said suddenly, turning back to me. Where is he? The question was too similar to her son's not to raise my suspicions. Gone, ma'am. He left when he found out about the baby. A coward, then, she said dismissively. The world is full of them, men who cannot face the consequences of their actions. She studied me for a long moment. How far along are you? 18 weeks, ma'am. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. You will need proper care. Antonio told me he has arranged for a doctor? Yes, ma'am. Dr. Bennett has been to see me already. Good. At least my son remembers some of what I taught him about responsibility. She moved to one of the armchairs and sat with regal posture. Now, about that bath and tea. I hurried to the bathroom, grateful for the chance to escape her piercing gaze and unsettling questions. As I ran the water and arranged her bath oils and towels, I tried to make sense of the strange dynamic between mother and son, and where exactly I fit into their complicated relationship. One thing was becoming increasingly clear. I had been brought into the Salvatore household for reasons beyond simply attending to an elderly woman. What those reasons were, and whether they boded well or ill for me and my child, remained to be seen. That night, after Sophia had finally retired following a lengthy dinner during which she had criticized everything from the wine selection to the table settings, I returned to my room exhausted. The physical demands of the day had been manageable, but the mental strain of navigating Sophia Salvatore's moods and probing questions had left me drained. I had just changed into my nightgown when another knock came at my door. Thinking it might be Mrs. Reynolds checking on how the first day had gone, I called. "Come in." Once again, it was Antonio Salvatore who entered, still dressed in the suit he'd worn at dinner. He looked as fresh and composed as he had that morning, while I felt rumpled and tired. "You survived your first day with my mother," he said, and I thought I detected a trace of humor in his tone. "She's formidable," I replied diplomatically. This time I was certain the slight quirk of his lips was amusement. "A diplomatic answer. She interrogated you, I assume?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share about my conversations with his mother. "You can speak freely," he said, seeming to read my thoughts. "I have no illusions about my mother's methods." "She asked why you hired me," I admitted. "She seems to think it's unusual for you." He moved further into the room, his presence immediately making the spacious suite feel smaller. "And what did you tell her? The truth? That I worked here before, and that you've been generous in my current situation?" He nodded slightly, then reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope I had given him the night before, the one containing everything I knew about Matteo. To my surprise, he handed it back to me, still sealed. "Keep this," he said. "I no longer need it." A chill ran down my spine. What does that mean? His expression revealed nothing. "It means the matter has been resolved." "Matteo," I began, but he cut me off with a raised hand. "Is no longer your concern. He will not trouble you or your child again." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I wanted to ask what exactly he had done, but fear stopped me. Some things were better left unknown. "Thank you," I said finally, because what else could I say? He studied me for a long moment, that same inscrutable look I was beginning to recognize. "You're different from what I expected, Lucia Rossi." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "My mother will be here for at least 3 months. Longer, if she takes a liking to you." He glanced back at me. "For your sake, I hope she does." Then he was gone, leaving me once again with more questions than answers, and the disturbing certainty that whatever had happened to Matteo, it had been swift and final. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, then moved to the fireplace where a small fire had been lit against the evening chill. Without opening it, I tossed the envelope into the flames, watching as it blackened and curled, taking with it the last remnants of my old life. Days turned into weeks in the Salvatore household. Against all expectations, Sophia and I developed a routine that bordered on comfortable. Her demands remained exacting, her criticism constant, but beneath her sharp exterior, I began to glimpse something else, a loneliness that mirrored my own. Each morning I would bring her breakfast precisely at 7, open the curtains to let in exactly the right amount of light, and listen as she complained about everything from the weather to the headlines in the newspaper I placed beside her coffee. Yet occasionally, when she thought I wasn't looking, I would catch her watching me with an expression that seemed almost soft. "You carry the child well," she remarked one morning, as I arranged her medications by her plate. "Some women become shapeless, but you have maintained your dignity." Coming from Sophia, this was high praise indeed. "Thank you, ma'am." She sipped her coffee, eyes studying me over the rim of her cup. "When I was carrying Antonio, I was sick every day for 5 months. His father said it meant the child would be strong-willed." A rare smile touched her lips. He was not wrong. These glimpses into her past were becoming more frequent, little breadcrumbs of personal history dropped into our daily interactions. I had learned to listen without pressing, knowing that questions might cause her to retreat behind her imperious facade. "Have you thought of names?" she asked, surprising me with the personal question. My hand moved instinctively to my now prominent belly. Not yet. It felt premature. She made a dismissive sound. Superstitious nonsense. A child should have a name waiting for them, something with meaning, with history. I nodded, not wanting to explain that in my precarious situation, allowing myself to plan too far ahead had seemed dangerous, a temptation of fate. Now, though, with the security of the Salvatore household around me, perhaps I could begin to think beyond mere survival. Antonio was named for his grandfather, Sophia continued. A great man, principled, strong. She set down her cup with a decisive click. Family names matter, Lucia. They connect us to those who came before, remind us of our obligations to those who will come after. My father's name was Marco, I offered quietly. My mother's father was Giovanni. Sophia nodded approvingly. Good. Strong Italian names. You should consider them. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Marco, Mr. Salvatore's right-hand man, entered with his usual efficiency. Excuse the interruption, Mrs. Salvatore, Miss Rossi. Mr. Salvatore has requested Miss Rossi's presence in his study when you've finished breakfast. Sophia's eyebrows rose slightly, but she waved a dismissive hand. Take her. I'll rest until my bath at 9. Marco nodded and retreated, clearly expecting me to follow. I quickly ensured Sophia had everything she needed, then followed him through the now familiar corridors to Antonio Salvatore's study. In the weeks since Sophia's arrival, my interactions with Antonio had been limited and formal. He would inquire about his mother's welfare during dinner, which I was now expected to attend despite my discomfort at being treated as something between staff and family. Occasionally, I would encounter him in the hallways or gardens, where he would acknowledge me with a nod or brief greeting. But we had not been alone together since the night he returned my envelope about Matteo. Marco knocked at the study door, then opened it for me without entering himself. Miss Rossi, sir, he announced, then closed the door behind me. Antonio sat behind his desk, as imposing as the first time I'd seen him there. Papers were spread before him, but his attention was entirely focused on me as I entered. I noticed his eyes lingering briefly on my more pronounced pregnancy before returning to my face. Lucia, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Sit. How are you feeling? The solicitous question caught me off guard. I'm well, thank you. Dr. Bennett says everything is progressing normally. He nodded, seeming pleased. And my mother? She treats you well? I chose my words carefully. Mrs. Salvatore is exactly as you described her. Particular but not unkind. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. A diplomatic answer. My mother has always been challenging, but she respects those who stand their ground. You seem to have found the right balance with her. I try to anticipate her needs, I said simply. A valuable skill. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with that same intensity I'd never quite grown accustomed to. I've noticed you've been taking your meals in your room when not required at my mother's table. It wasn't a question, but I felt compelled to explain. I didn't want to presume. The staff dining room doesn't seem appropriate anymore, but the family dining room, I trailed off, uncertain how to express my discomfort with my ambiguous position in the household. You belong at the family table, he said firmly. You care for my mother. You live in the family wing. Your child will be born in this house. He paused, then added, unless you have other plans after the birth. The question hung between us, weighted with implications I couldn't fully decipher. Did he expect me to leave once the baby was born? Was he offering me a choice, or was there something else behind his careful phrasing? I haven't thought that far ahead, I admitted. My focus has been on ensuring a healthy pregnancy and caring for your mother. He nodded slowly. A practical approach. His gaze held mine for a moment longer than comfortable. My mother seems to have taken to you. She speaks of you. Favorably. Coming from Sophia Salvatore, that was surprising indeed. I'm glad to hear it. She has opinions about your child, he continued, a hint of amusement in his tone. Names she considers suitable. Education she deems appropriate. I couldn't help the small smile that formed. She mentioned names this morning. She's very decided about family traditions. My mother has plans for everyone, he said dryly. She had my life mapped out before I could walk. Something shifted in his expression then, a brief glimpse of the weight he carried. Some of her plans I followed. Others took different paths. The understatement hung between us, acknowledged but not explored. We both knew what those different paths had led to, the empire of legitimate businesses and shadowy enterprises that made the name Salvatore both respected and feared. I didn't ask you here to discuss my mother's plans, however, he said, redirecting the conversation. There's a matter that requires addressing. He reached into his desk drawer, and withdrew a thick envelope, which he slid across to me. "Open it." With slightly trembling fingers, I did as instructed. Inside was a legal document with my name at the top. As I scanned the pages, my confusion grew. "This is a trust fund? For my baby?" Antonio nodded once. "It will provide for the child's education and future needs, regardless of circumstances." I looked up at him, bewildered. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" His expression remained impassive. "Consider it payment for your service to my mother." But even as he said it, I knew it wasn't the full truth. No amount of attending to an elderly woman, however demanding, warranted this kind of generosity. There was something else at work here. Something he wasn't saying. "Mr. Salvatore," I began carefully, "this is extremely generous, but—" "It's not negotiable," he interrupted, his tone making it clear the matter was settled. "The papers require your signature. A copy will be kept with my attorney." I stared at the document in my hands, overwhelmed by the implications. My child, who I had feared would be born into insecurity and hardship, would now have financial stability guaranteed. It was everything I had prayed for in that church, and more. Yet the circumstances, the man providing it, filled me with unease. "Thank you," I said finally, because regardless of my confusion, gratitude was the only appropriate response. He inclined his head slightly, accepting my thanks without comment. Then, surprising me further, he rose from his desk and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds with his back to me. "There will be a dinner here tomorrow night," he said, changing the subject abruptly. "Associates of mine. Important connections. My mother will attend, and I would like you there as well." The request, or command, caught me off guard. Me? I don't understand what role I would play at a business dinner. He turned back to face me, his expression unreadable. "My mother is more controlled when you are present, less likely to say things that might complicate matters." I frowned slightly. "You want me to manage your mother during a business dinner? I want you to continue doing what you've been doing, attending to her needs while maintaining a calming presence." A hint of something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "You have a gift for handling difficult personalities, Lucia, including yours." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I immediately tensed, expecting displeasure at my impertinence. Instead, to my shock, Antonio Salvatore actually smiled, a brief, genuine expression that transformed his severe features and reached his eyes. Especially mine, perhaps. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. "You'll need something appropriate to wear. Marco will arrange it." And with that, I was dismissed, the trust fund documents clutched in my hand, and more questions than ever swirling in my mind. The dress that arrived the next morning was elegant but modest, a deep blue maternity gown that draped perfectly over my baby bump while maintaining a dignified silhouette. It came with simple pearl jewelry and low-heeled shoes that were both stylish and comfortable. Sophia, upon seeing me dressed for the evening, nodded with grudging approval. At least Antonio knows how to dress a woman appropriately for her station. Too many young girls these days think showing everything is the same as elegance. I took her backhanded compliment in stride, having learned that this was as close to praise as Sofia Salvatore usually came. I helped her with her own preparations, a sophisticated black dress that highlighted her still trim figure, her silver hair arranged elegantly, and her family jewelry gleaming at her throat and wrists. "These men tonight," she said as I fastened her necklace. "They are important to Antonio's business interests. You will say little, observe much, and remember everything. My son values discretion above all else." The instructions seemed odd coming from her, given Mr. Salvatore's insistence that his mother remain deliberately ignorant of his less legitimate enterprises. But I simply nodded, focusing on ensuring every detail of her appearance was perfect. When we descended to the main floor together, Antonio was waiting in the grand foyer, impeccable in a tailored black suit. His eyes moved between his mother and me, lingering slightly longer on me in a way that made warmth rise to my cheeks. "You both look lovely," he said, offering his arm to his mother while inclining his head to me. "Our guests will be arriving shortly. Lucia, you'll be seated beside my mother, across from Marco and myself." The positioning was significant, close enough to attend to Sophia, but also directly in Antonio's line of sight throughout the meal. I nodded my understanding, following them into the formal dining room where everything had been arranged with meticulous attention to detail. As the first of the black SUVs began to arrive outside, Antonio turned to me one last time, his voice low and intended only for my ears. "Remember, Lucia, in this house, you are under my protection. No matter what you see or hear tonight, you are safe." The words, meant to reassure, instead sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. What exactly was I about to witness at this dinner that required such assurance? The dinner guests were not what I had expected. Rather than the rough, dangerous men I had imagined would associate with someone of Antonio Salvatore's reputation, they were polished, sophisticated individuals, a judge, a city councilman, the owner of a major construction company, and a well-known attorney. Their wives accompanied them, all elegantly dressed and coolly assessing as they entered the dining room. I felt their eyes on me as Antonio made introductions, noting the careful way he presented me. Miss Rossi, my mother's companion. Not staff, not friend, but something deliberately ambiguous that left them free to draw their own conclusions. The women's gazes lingered on my pregnant form before shifting away, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. I was clearly not one of them, but neither was I serving them, and this uncertainty seemed to make them uncomfortable. Dinner proceeded with impeccable service and superficial pleasantries. I kept my focus on Sophia, ensuring her glass was filled, her needs anticipated, while keeping my own participation in the conversation to a minimum. Just as Antonio had suggested, my presence seemed to temper his mother's sharper impulses. Whenever she began to veer toward potentially controversial topics, a subtle touch on her arm or a quiet word was enough to redirect her. The conversation flowed around me, discussions of property developments, city contracts, judicial appointments, and charitable foundations. On the surface, everything sounded legitimate, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite grasp, a language of implication and subtle nods that suggested more was being communicated than the words themselves conveyed. I noticed how the others deferred to Antonio, how their laughter at his rare jokes came too quickly, their agreement with his opinions too eager. These were powerful men in their own right, yet in his presence, they were careful, watchful, like courtiers around a king they both respected and feared. "Miss Rossi," the judge's wife addressed me suddenly during dessert, breaking my observation. "Antonio tells us you're expecting. How wonderful. When are you due?" All eyes turned to me, and I felt Antonio's gaze most keenly of all. "In about 4 months," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my discomfort at the attention. "And you're staying here in the Salvatore home?" she continued, her tone innocent but her eyes sharp. "How progressive." There was a subtle challenge in her words, an implication I didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized as dangerous. Before I could formulate a response, Sophia spoke up. "Lucia is family," she said firmly, her accent more pronounced than usual. "The child will be born here, where I can ensure everything is done properly." She cast a dismissive look at the woman. "Americans are too quick to send new mothers home from hospitals. In Italy, we know better." Her declaration, especially the loaded word family, sent a ripple of reaction around the table. The attorney raised an eyebrow. The councilman's wife exchanged a glance with her husband. And Antonio. Antonio's expression remained impassive, but I saw his hand tighten briefly around his wine glass. "Of course," the judge's wife murmured, properly chastised. "How fortunate for Miss Rossi to have your guidance." The moment passed, conversation shifted to other topics, but I remained unsettled. What had just happened? What had Sophia's words implied to these people? And why had Antonio not corrected whatever misapprehension she had created? After dinner, the men moved to Antonio's study for brandy and cigars, while the women retired to the drawing room. I helped Sophia to her preferred armchair, then took a seat slightly apart from the group, maintaining my ambiguous position between guest and staff. The women's conversation became more relaxed away from their husbands, focusing on local gossip and subtle one-upmanship about their children's achievements and vacation homes. I listened politely, offering nothing, observing everything as Sophia had instructed. "You must find this all very different from your previous life," the attorney's wife said to me during a lull, her curiosity finally overcoming social restraint. "Every day brings new experiences," I replied neutrally, aware of Sophia watching our exchange with hawkish attention. "I imagine it would," the woman continued. "Antonio has always been particular about his household. You must be very special to have earned a place here." There was that implication again, something beyond my role as Sophia's companion, something I couldn't quite grasp, but that these women seemed to take for granted. "Lucia understands discretion," Sophia interjected before I could respond. "A quality too rare these days." The message was clear. This line of questioning was closed. The women took the hint, returning to safer topics until their husbands rejoined us. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, I noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The judge and the councilman spoke quietly with Antonio near the door, their expressions more serious than they had been during dinner. The construction company owner handed Marco a thick envelope, which disappeared immediately into his jacket. I helped Sophia back to her rooms, my mind whirling with everything I had observed. As I assisted her with her jewelry and prepared her nighttime medications, she watched me in the mirror. "You have questions," she said. Not a question herself, but a statement of fact. I met her gaze in the reflection. "Many." She smiled slightly. "But you are too wise to ask them." "Good." She took the glass of water I offered with her pills. "My son was right about you. You see much, say little." "Mrs. Salvatore," I ventured carefully, "those people tonight, they think I am something to your son that I am not." She raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think they believe you are?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "They seem to think I have a personal relationship with Mr. Salvatore, one that goes beyond my role here." Sophia turned to face me directly. "And this bothers you? To be thought of as my son's woman?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. "It bothers me to be misunderstood," I replied finally. "To have people make assumptions about me, about my child." She studied me for a long moment. "In this life, Lucia, it is often safer to let people believe what they wish. Their assumptions become a shield behind which you can observe unnoticed." She patted my hand in an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. "Besides, there are worse things than being associated with my son. He is a powerful man. His protection is valuable. His protection comes at a price," I said softly, the words escaping before I could censor them. Rather than being offended, Sophia nodded approvingly. "You understand more than you admit. Good. Survival in our world requires clarity of vision." She settled back against her pillows. "That will be all for tonight." Dismissed, I retreated to my own rooms, my mind still turning over the events of the evening. I changed out of the blue dress, hanging it carefully in my closet, and had just finished washing my face when a soft knock came at my door. I had begun to expect these late-night visits from Antonio, though they were infrequent and always brief. Wrapping my robe more securely around me, I called, "Come in." Antonio entered, still in his dinner suit though he had loosened his tie. He looked tired but alert, his eyes taking in my damp face and nightclothes with that same inscrutable expression. "You did well tonight," he said without preamble. "Thank you," I replied, unsure what else to say. "Your mother was easier to manage than I expected." A hint of amusement touched his features. "She behaves herself when she approves of the company." He moved further into the room, stopping by the fireplace where a small fire burned against the evening chill. "The others were curious about you." I chose my words carefully. "I noticed. They seem to have certain assumptions. Does that trouble you?" The echo of his mother's question was striking. "Should it?" He studied me for a long moment. "Their assumptions provide a certain protection. An explanation for your presence here that satisfies curiosity without revealing truth." "And what is the truth, Mr. Salvatore?" I asked quietly. "Why am I really here? It can't just be to manage your mother's moods." For a moment, I thought I had pushed too far. His expression closed, the brief openness gone. But then he surprised me, moving to sit in one of the armchairs by the fire, gesturing for me to take the other. "My mother was right about one thing," he said once I was seated. "Discretion is rare and valuable. You have worked in my home for months, seen things, heard things. Yet nothing has ever leaked beyond these walls. I mind my own business, I said simply. You do. But more than that, you understand loyalty. He leaned forward slightly, firelight casting shadows across his features. The day I saw you in the church, do you believe in fate, Lucia? The question caught me off guard. I don't know. Maybe. I rarely attend services myself. That day I had gone to light a candle for my father's anniversary. If I had been an hour earlier or later, our paths would not have crossed. I remembered that day vividly, my desperation, my tears, the sudden shift in the church's atmosphere when he entered. Why did you help me? Really? He was silent for a long moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. I saw something in you that I recognized, he said finally. Strength, even in vulnerability. Dignity, even in desperation. His dark eyes held mine, and I saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? For both of us to solve a problem. He gestured vaguely toward my belly. You needed security, protection. I needed someone I could trust with my mother. Someone who would be invested in maintaining their position here. It made a cold kind of sense. The pregnant, desperate woman with no options would be grateful, loyal, unlikely to betray his confidence. And yet, the trust fund, I said slowly. The way you've treated me, it goes beyond ensuring my loyalty. Something flickered in his expression, too quickly gone for me to interpret. Perhaps I recognized the value of what you provide. He stood abruptly, signaling the end of our conversation. Tomorrow my mother has her weekly doctor's appointment. Marco will drive you both. I nodded, understanding I had pushed as far as I could for one night. Good night, Mr. Salvatore. He paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Antonio, he said. In private, you should call me Antonio. The concession, small but significant, hung between us for a moment before he nodded once and left, closing the door quietly behind him. The following weeks fell into a pattern. During the day, I attended to Sophia's needs, accompanying her to doctor's appointments, helping her with correspondence, listening to her increasingly frequent reminiscences about Italy and Antonio's childhood. In the evenings, I would sometimes be included in family dinners, seated across from Antonio, aware of his gaze on me throughout the meal. And occasionally, he would visit my rooms late at night, our conversations gradually extending beyond the immediate concerns of the household to more personal topics, books we had read, places we had seen or hoped to see, carefully edited stories from our pasts. We never touched. He maintained a careful physical distance, always proper, always controlled. Yet there was a growing tension between us, an awareness that neither acknowledged, but both felt. In his presence, I was increasingly conscious of my own body, the quickening of my pulse, the heat that would rise to my cheeks when his gaze lingered too long. It was confusing, unsettling. He was not the kind of man I would have chosen in my previous life, too dangerous, too powerful, too steeped in a world I didn't fully understand. Yet I could not deny the pull between us, the strange comfort I found in his presence despite the inherent threat he represented. My pregnancy progressed, my body changing week by week. Dr. Bennett's visits confirmed the baby, a boy we now knew, was healthy and strong. Sophia took this news with surprising enthusiasm, immediately launching into plans for the nursery and insisting on Italian linens for the crib she had ordered. A boy needs a strong name, she declared during one of our afternoon teas. Have you decided yet? I hesitated. I've been considering Giovanni, after my grandfather. She nodded approvingly. A good name, strong, traditional. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. You know, Antonio's middle name is Giovanni, after his own grandfather. The information surprised me, another small piece of the puzzle that was Antonio Salvatore. I didn't know that. Sophia smiled slightly. There is much about my son you do not know, but perhaps in time. She let the thought hang unfinished, her eyes watching me with that knowing look that always made me feel like she could see right through me, to feelings I myself was only beginning to acknowledge. My son was born on a stormy October night, arriving 2 weeks earlier than expected. The labor started suddenly while I was helping Sophia with her evening routine. a sharp pain that made me gasp and reach for the edge of the dresser to steady myself. Sophia recognized what was happening before I did. "Marco!" she called sharply through the open door to her sitting room, where he often waited during my evening duties. "Get the doctor. The baby is coming." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and focused determination. "Doctor." Bennett arrived quickly, converting my bedroom into a makeshift delivery room with practiced efficiency. Sophia refused to leave, positioning herself at my side, her usual imperious manner transformed into steady support as she held my hand and spoke calm encouragements in a mixture of English and Italian. Antonio was away on business, something that had taken him out of the city for 3 days, with only Marco knowing exactly where. In lucid moments between contractions, I found myself wishing he were there, a feeling that surprised me with its intensity. "Push now," Dr. Bennett instructed as the final stage approached. "Your son is ready to meet you." With Sophia's hand gripped tightly in mine, I gave one final, exhausting push, and then a cry. Strong, indignant, alive. "He's perfect," Dr. Bennett announced, placing the squirming, red-faced bundle on my chest. Healthy lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for. I looked down at my son through tears of exhaustion and overwhelming love. His tiny face was scrunched in protest at his abrupt entry into the world, his little fists waving in displeasure. Dark hair, like mine, like Matteo's, was plastered wetly to his head. "Giovanni," I whispered, touching his cheek with a trembling finger. "My Giovanni." Sophia leaned closer, her expression softer than I had ever seen it. "He is beautiful, Lucia, strong, like his name." The next few hours were devoted to the practicalities of new motherhood, learning to nurse, being checked by Dr. Bennett, watching as my son was measured, weighed, and swaddled. Sophia eventually retired to her own rooms, but not before placing her hand briefly on Giovanni's head in what felt almost like a blessing. I had just managed to settle Giovanni in the bassinet that had been set up beside my bed when the door to my suite opened quietly. Looking up, expecting Dr. Bennett returning for another check, I instead saw Antonio standing in the doorway. He was still in his traveling clothes, an open-collared shirt under a dark jacket, his hair slightly disheveled as if he had come directly from his journey. His eyes moved from me to the bassinet, his expression a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. "You're back," I said softly, aware of my son's precarious sleep. Marco called me. He stepped into the room, approaching the bassinet with an almost hesitant stride. "He's early." 2 weeks, I confirmed, watching as Antonio looked down at Giovanni for the first time. "The doctor says he's perfect, healthy." Antonio nodded, his gaze fixed on the sleeping infant. Something in his expression shifted, a softening I had never seen before, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with everything I knew about this powerful, dangerous man. "Giovanni," he said quietly, the name sounding different in his voice, weighted with something I didn't understand. "A good name." "After my grandfather," I said, then hesitated before adding, "And your middle name, your mother told me." He glanced up at me, a fleeting smile touching his lips. "My mother has always appreciated connections." We remained like that for a moment, Antonio standing by the bassinet, me propped up in bed, Giovanni sleeping peacefully between us. An image of family that wasn't quite true but wasn't entirely false either. "You should rest," he said finally, stepping back from the bassinet. "You've had a difficult night." I nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion settling over me. "Thank you for coming." He paused at the door, looking back with that same inscrutable expression I had never fully learned to read. "I would not have missed it," he said simply. And then he was gone. The next weeks passed in the hazy, sleep-deprived blur that all new mothers know. Giovanni proved to be a healthy but demanding infant, with strong lungs that made his displeasure known throughout the East Wing. To my surprise, Sophia never complained about the disruption. Instead, she seemed to take a proprietary interest in her grandson, a term she began using without qualification, despite the obvious lack of blood connection. Even more surprising was Antonio's involvement. Though his business still took him away frequently, when he was home, He would often appear in my suite during Giovanni's evening bath or morning feeding. He never asked to hold the baby, but he would watch with that same intense focus he brought to everything, occasionally asking questions about Giovanni's development or needs. One evening, about 6 weeks after Giovanni's birth, I was walking the floor with him during a particularly fussy period when Antonio appeared at my door. He entered without knocking, a habit he had developed over these weeks of informal visits, and immediately assessed the situation. "He's been crying for an hour," I explained, my voice strained with fatigue. "I've fed him, changed him, checked for fever. Nothing helps." Antonio moved closer, studying Giovanni's red, tear-streaked face. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms in a gesture that shocked me. Hesitantly, I transferred my son to his care, watching nervously as Antonio adjusted the baby against his chest. His hands I knew were capable of violence, of power, were surprisingly gentle as they supported Giovanni's head and back. "My father used to walk with me like this," he said, beginning to pace the room with a smooth, rhythmic stride. "According to my mother, I was a difficult infant. Only movement would calm me." To my astonishment, Giovanni's cries began to diminish as Antonio walked, his little body gradually relaxing against the broad chest. Within minutes, he had settled into hiccuping sighs, his eyes growing heavy. "How did you do that?" I whispered, amazed at the transformation. Antonio's lips curved in a slight smile. "Some men respond to authority." He looked down at the now sleeping infant in his arms, though this one may be too young for such tactics. The sight of my son cradled against Antonio Salvatore's chest created a strange ache in my heart, a longing for something I had never expected to want, a family configuration that seemed both impossible and increasingly real. As Giovanni grew stronger, a routine developed. On nights when Antonio was home, he would often take this evening shift, walking with Giovanni until he settled. On rare occasions, I would find him in the nursery that had been prepared adjacent to my suite, sitting in the rocking chair with my son, speaking softly to him in Italian, words I couldn't quite catch from the doorway, but which seemed to mesmerize Giovanni completely. It was during one of these quiet evenings, with Giovanni finally asleep in his crib, and Antonio lingering in my sitting room, that everything changed between us. "He looks like you," Antonio observed, accepting the glass of wine I offered as we sat before the fire, around the eyes. I smiled, glancing toward the open door to the nursery where Giovanni slept peacefully. "Everyone says that, but I see his father in him too. The shape of his mouth, the way he frowns when he's thinking." As soon as I mentioned Matteo, I regretted it. We had never spoken of him since that night Antonio had returned my envelope. His name hung in the air between us, charged with unasked questions. "Do you miss him?" Antonio asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The father." I considered the question seriously, my fingers tracing the rim of my own wineglass. "No," I said finally. "I miss the idea of what should have been, a partner, a complete family for Giovanni, but Matteo himself?" I shook my head. "He showed me who he truly was when he took my savings and left. I don't miss that man." Antonio nodded slightly, his gaze focused on the fire rather than on me. "And now? Are you content here?" The question seemed weighted with more than casual inquiry. I looked at him, trying to read his expression and profile. "Giovanni is safe here, protected, loved, not just by me, but by your mother. Even by you, in your way." I set my glass down, gathering my courage. "But there are things I don't understand. About why we're here. About what you want from us." He turned to me then, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "What do you think I want, Lucia?" "I don't know," I admitted. "At first I thought you simply needed someone to manage your mother. Then I wondered if you kept me here out of some sense of responsibility or charity." I hesitated, then pressed on. "But the way you are with Giovanni, the trust fund, these conversations between us, it suggests something else." Antonio set his glass aside and rose from his chair, moving to stand by the fire. For a long moment, he was silent, his back to me, shoulders tense beneath his fine shirt. "When I was 10 years old," he began unexpectedly, "my father took me to his office for the first time. He sat me in his chair, put his hands on my shoulders, and told me that someday, everything he had built would be mine. He turned slightly, his profile harsh in the firelight, but it came with obligations. Family above all else. Protection of our own. Continuation of the line. I remained silent, sensing he needed to speak without interruption. I fulfilled most of those obligations, he continued. I expanded what my father built. I protected our interests. But the continuation, he shook his head slightly. I never found a woman I could trust with both my name and my business. Until... He stopped abruptly, turning to face me fully. Until... I prompted softly. Until I saw you in that church, he said, his voice low and intent, praying not for yourself, but for your child, willing to face any hardship rather than abandon an innocent. His gaze held mine, more open than I had ever seen it. I recognized something in you, Lucia. Something rare. Something valuable. He moved closer, standing before my chair, looking down at me with an expression that made my heart race. I want you to stay, he said simply. Not as my mother's companion, not as staff, as my wife, as Giovanni's mother. The words hung between us, impossible and yet completely logical. The culmination of months of careful observation, growing trust, and an attraction neither of us had acknowledged but both had felt. Your wife, I repeated, the word feeling strange on my tongue. But Giovanni isn't. Giovanni will be my son in every way that matters, he interrupted, his voice firm. My name, my protection, my legacy. He knelt before my chair, bringing us eye to eye, and took my hands in his. I am offering you a choice, Lucia. A real one. Stay or go. But know that if you stay, it will be as my equal, not as my employee. I looked into his eyes I had once feared, then respected. And now, something else entirely. And if I say yes, what then? His hands tightened slightly around mine. Then we begin.